Welcome to Disaffected. I am Joshua Slocum, and this is the show where we talk about culture through a psychological lens. Right up at the top, a little bit of housekeeping and some corrections. A couple of you left comments about some remarks I made last week, and you found some errors. Thank you. I do appreciate that. So let's correct them. The first one is about Ibram X. Kendi, I was going to say critical race theorist, but he'll be quick to tell you, of course, that he's not a critical race theorist. He's an anti-racist. I said that he had changed his name, that his real name was Henry Rogers. I was only partially right about that. Apparently, the name he was given at birth was Ibram Henry Rogers, so Ibram was indeed his first name. But I found out the story about the rest of his name. So this is from the New Yorker. He changed his middle name from Henry to Zolani, which is Zulu for be peaceful, after learning the history of Prince Henry the Navigator, a 15th century Portuguese explorer who helped pioneer the African slave trade. And at his wedding in 2013, he and his wife Siddiqa told their guests that they had chosen a new last name, Kendi, which means the loved one, in the Kenyan language of Meru. So, I was mostly right. This is an image-conscious name change, even if he did it for slightly different reasons. And, of course, Ibram was, in fact, his first name. But this is the kind of thing that I'm constantly pointing to. The artifice, the stagecraft, the fakery, right? People who want to put out a certain image. They want to evoke certain things. I mean, listen to this. He got rid of the name his parents gave him, the middle name Henry, because he heard about Prince Henry the Navigator, a 15th century Portuguese explorer who helped pioneer the African slave trade, and that just made him feel terrible, apparently. Bunch of nonsense this is. Nonsense. That's enough of him. Thank you, though, for the correction, listener. The next one was about George Floyd, and I believe something that I have since found out is not true. While George Floyd was apparently convicted of aggravated robbery, he pulled a gun on somebody during a robbery. Apparently there was no indication that the woman was pregnant when he pointed the gun. So I said last week that he pointed a gun at a pregnant woman. That is not true. I believed it to be true, but it isn't true. I'd seen it in many different places, but apparently there isn't any evidence for that. So an aggravated robber, but not a pointer of gun at pregnant women, just at women who are not pregnant. There we go. Now I have a story for you from Canada. It's short, and I'm going to read it to you. This is from CP24, which is a TV station in Toronto. Quote, a woman is facing charges after she allegedly sexually assaulted a child in a Toronto park 2 months ago, and police believe there may be other victims. According to police, a 6-year-old boy attended Walter Saunders Park near Dufferin Street and Eglinton Avenue West on May 20th. At the time, the boy was sexually assaulted, police said. An investigation was launched by the Toronto Police Service's Child and Youth Advocacy Centre. As a result of their investigation, 33-year-old Toronto resident Ruby Eby was arrested on June 8th. She is charged with sexual interference with a person under the age of 16 and with sexual assault. Eby is set to appear in a Toronto courtroom on July 21st. In a news release issued on Tuesday, police said investigators believe there may be other victims. Police are asking anyone with information related to the investigation to contact investigators or Crime Stoppers. So, an alarming story, sad story, about a 6-year-old boy being sexually assaulted by a woman named Ruby. You're watching on video? Take a look at Ruby. That's Ruby. And for those of you who are listening and not watching, this is a picture of a man. A very obvious, square-faced, lantern-jawed man who appears to be about 30 years old. This is the image they're running with the story that's about a woman who sexually assaulted a 6-year-old boy. I don't know how many of you have seen media nonsense like this before, but I think I have to have seen hundreds of these, either headlines or stories written saying, she did this, the woman did this, the woman did this. I started to notice a few years ago, my goodness, we're hearing about a lot of awfully violent crimes and violent crimes of a sexual nature committed by women. That's funny. You don't usually hear about this many violent sexual crimes committed by women. Well, why is that? It's because women aren't committing them. Men are. I hope you haven't gotten used to this. Familiarity can dull your sense of outrage, but I hope that your sense of outrage has not been dulled. We are in an era in which mainstream media, television, social media, print, is routinely calling men women. They do it for 43-year-old Gavin Hubbard, the man from New Zealand who calls himself Laurel and claims to have transitioned, whatever that means. Seems to be purely linguistic. Who is competing at the Tokyo Olympics, representing New Zealand in the women's weightlifting competition. And we have story after story after story of crimes committed by alleged women who turn out to be men. I never thought we'd be in this situation. I've said this before, but it is worth repeating. If the media is telling you an obvious, flagrant lie, such as that men are women, or that this man pictured here is a woman named Ruby, if they are lying to you about this, if they're lying to me about this, they're lying to everybody about this. Why should we believe anything that the media reports on? If they will lie about something this obvious, why should we believe anything they report? Yes, I do think you should stop trusting the media completely. No, I can't tell you where to get the truth from. I've talked about this with a lot of people. It bothers me so much. I've talked about it with my therapist. What do we do in a landscape where we are routinely lied to this way? And the best that anybody's been able to come up with is try to read from a wide variety of sources, look for articles written from a different point of view. Don't automatically write off sources that people tell you are tabloids or are run by conspiracy theory nuts. And some of them are, for sure. But here's the interesting thing about tabloids. We have a cultural prejudice against tabloids. What do we think of when we talk about tabloids? We think of things like the National Enquirer, the Star. We used to think of things like Weekly World News. You remember that black and white weekly tabloid that was at the checkout register of every grocery store talking about Bat Boy and aliens? So tabloid is shorthand for untrustworthy, cheap rag media. But I've noticed over the years, we describe tabloids often as being lurid and sensationalist, and there is a great deal of truth in that. But knowing how much criminal activity goes on, how much domestic violence goes on, that never makes it to the media, I often wonder if we haven't given tabloids an unfairly tarnished reputation. Because sometimes it seems to me that they report more truthfully on the uglier and unpleasant side of life than what you see in the pages of the New York Times. Anyway, food for thought. What do we have next? More nonsense and lying and delusion. Naturally, this is Disaffected. What did you think you were watching? A game show? I'm going to play you a series of short videos, and these come from an account on Twitter called Libs of TikTok. Libs of TikTok, thank you very much for documenting this stuff. If you are on Twitter, I highly recommend following this account. It'll drive you nuts, and you're going to need to put yourself on a reasonable restrictive diet. But the things that this person comes up with are just amazing. So let's run the first one, Kevin.
A lot of conflict going on inside of me right now. There's a part of me that sees this pregnancy as like masculine. It's like very much for me not a feminine feeling.
Mm-hmm. He just left the hospital right now.
Yeah, so they totally thought Patrona was the pregnant one and not me. It didn't even speak to me. And I just felt like
they just made assumptions. Making an assumption from the very beginning without even asking our names, not asking a thing about us.
I'm the one that's waking up every hour, having to pee, and like, the one's been throwing up and like going through all this crap. The thought that I exist with a baby inside me never crossed their mind. Put yourself in my shoes, like, how would that make you feel?
It wouldn't make me feel anyway because I'm not suffering from borderline personality disorder. Ahuna. Yes, apparently that is this person's name. No, I don't think she was given it at birth. Okay, so what you're listening to, those of you on audio only, this is a video. This is a couple, a man and a woman, both of whom have transitioned. So she, the actual woman, is the man in the relationship because she's transitioned her gender. And the man, whose name is Patrona, sure, Jan, is the one who would like to be seen as the mother. So this is a series of little bits. I don't know who's filming this. I don't know if they're doing it themselves. But Ahuna, the man, is pregnant. And it seems fairly clear that Patrona, the woman, is the father. What am I even saying? If anybody finds this podcast 1,000 years from now and plays this, they're going to think I'm clinically insane because nothing I'm saying makes any sense. So what's going on here? They go to the hospital, probably for a prenatal checkup, and they're upset that the hospital staff turned to Patrona, the actual man who's transitioned to a woman, and assumed that he was the pregnant one, not Ahuna, the actual woman who is pregnant, who's presenting as a man. I have such sympathy for hospital staff at this point. I don't know how they deal with this stuff. And here's what's really interesting. Okay, so first of all, yeah, this all looks very consistent with cluster B personality disorder mentation. This looks consistent with borderline personality disorder. Remember that borderline, one of the features of borderline personality disorder is an unstable sense of identity, an unstable and fluctuating self-image. And as I've said before, I don't think there's any better illustration of that dynamic than the act of transitioning itself, right? If you are convinced that you are not actually the sex that your body is and that there's some internal essence, another part of you that's essentially another sex or not a sex at all, and that looks to me like a very classic borderline self-image problem, right? We're used to thinking of, to the extent that any of us are aware of what borderline personality disorder is, most people are used to seeing the unstable identity express itself in more familiar and conventional ways. Constant changes of hair color, completely different mode of dressing from one week to a next, different accents. Well, I mean, Madonna, right? Take Madonna. And yeah, I think Madonna has a personality disorder, and I think she has heavy features of borderline personality disorder. Don't know for sure, can't diagnose, but that's what I think. You know, the constant hair color changing, the constant adoption of a new persona, which she always calls reinventing herself, and sure, yes, has a commercial purpose, but I suspect it's also tied to an actual unstable sense of who she is consistently from one day to the next. The adoption of the British accent, that affectation that she took on in the mid-90s when she was training for the film role in Evita. But I think it's very clear when it comes to transgender-related issues. I don't think there's anything more unstable than saying, you know, I have the body of a woman, but I'm actually a man. And Ahuna is upset that nobody asked her about how she was feeling because they didn't think she was pregnant. They looked at her partner, Petrona, a man who's transitioned to a woman, and assumed that the woman was the one pregnant. Well, what the hell do you expect people to assume? And don't tell me not to make assumptions. This is one of those exhortations that you hear from social justice types and lefty types of this stripe. Don't make assumptions about people. Don't think in stereotypes. They're really not talking about not thinking in terms of stereotypes. They really mean don't make any assumptions at all. If you don't make any assumptions, you can't think as a human being. Our thought process, how we see the world, how we integrate things, depends on matching sensory data up with already recognized patterns that we are familiar with, right? If I see a woman walking across the street, it is a normal and natural assumption that she has breasts and a vagina. I mean, not that I'm looking at women, oh, that one has breasts and vagina. That one too has breasts and vagina. Maybe not the best example, but you can't not make assumptions. And what is the point of transitioning if not to compel other people to make the assumptions about you that you wish them to make? I'm not a woman, but I want you to see me as a woman. I'm not a man, but I want you to see me as a man. That's what the demands, the pronoun demands are about. That's what referring to the person as the sex they're not is all about. It reminds me of a song. I have a sort of list in my head of songs that I'm quite certain are actually about a relationship with a borderline, even if the songwriter didn't know it. If She Knew What She Wants, Jules Shear's song. You probably know the more popular cover by the Bangles. If she knew what she wants, he'd be giving it to her, giving it to her. There's a line in there that has stuck with me for a long time because it makes me think of my mother, although it's a song about I think a romantic relationship. I think it's a song about dealing with a borderline. And the line goes, then one day she's satisfied, and the next I'll find her crying, and it's nothing she can explain. That's what's going on here. One day she's satisfied, the next I'll find her crying, and it's nothing she can explain. Nothing's good enough. Nothing will satisfy this anxiety that this woman is feeling, because she's experiencing the kind of anxiety that comes from a borderline personality style. It's unhealthy, it's destructive, it's causing her suffering. We've got two more from these people. Let's go to the next one.
I'm trying to come out.
It's okay, baby.
They're completely out. Can I bring them out?
Yes.
Oh my God. What's a cord? Oh,
Come.
oh.
It's okay. It's okay, baby.
Can you do it?
Here, can you help me lift up my leg? Oh my gosh.
They're so cute.
Are they breathing? I don't hear any crying, and that starts to raise the blood pressure. Like, I know I should be hearing them cry by now. Come on, babe. Put them on me. You're rubbing them on their back. Roll them and rub them right their back. Come on, babe.
Ugh. I'm sorry. I'm simultaneously grossed out and convulsed. So what you were listening to there, they're having a home birth, this couple. And there's so much in here that I want to point out. You hear that voice, you hear that artificial testosterone voice. That's what happens. It's not quite as froggy as some of them, but it has that froggy quality. That's what happens to a woman's voice when she takes testosterone and it lowers, and it's permanent, right? There's something a little bit off about it. It's male, but it isn't quite male. So they're having a home birth, and they've got a goddamn inflatable kiddie wading pool set up in the living room that she's heaved herself up into so that she can push this baby out. They've got a doula helping with the birth there. God, good Lord, I wonder what this woman said when she went home to her family and they asked her how her day went. I don't know. I may never know again. And she's giving birth, and I don't even know what pronouns to use because I don't understand how to talk about this. And her partner, the actual man who's transitioned to a woman, is helping her pull the baby out. And she says, cut the cord. Did you notice as this is going on? I mean, if you're just listening, you can't see this, but the visual, this whole thing, you know what it is? It's right out of a John Waters film. It's right out of Female Trouble. If you guys don't know John Waters, look up John Waters, famous director, made sort of gonzo feature films. Got mainstream acceptance with Hairspray, I think was his first mainstream film. And he made a series of low-budget films in the early 70s with Divine, a famous drag queen. Very large man. His name was Glenn Milstead. And Divine was John Waters' muse. And he played a female character, sort of like a morbidly obese trailer park Liz Taylor, right? That was the aesthetic. And there's this, in Female Trouble, excuse me, the plot is the main character, Dawn Davenport, played by Divine, Glenn Milstead, drag queen, is a juvenile delinquent and runs away from home and gets knocked up while she's still a high school student. And she's a slattern. She doesn't take care of herself. She's irresponsible. She smokes and drinks. And she finds a flop house of a hotel. Apparently she forgot she was pregnant, so she just stops into this flop house, rents a room for an hour, and gives birth on a couch. And you can see Glenn Milstead with a pillow underneath his dress going, oh, you know, drag queen labor, as you do. And the baby comes out, and Divine takes the cord like it was a sausage and just bites into it and goes, throws the cord away. That's what this looks like. And it's so ridiculous. And throughout the entire thing, they're keeping up the pretense. They keep referring to the baby as them. They and them. Are they out yet? Roll them over on their back. Put them on my chest. Creepy. Creepy. This poor child. And I saw people commenting on this on social media. And a lot of people said, call Child Protective Services, call the authorities. For what? What do you think the authorities are going to do? Because these days, children are being taken away from the custody of their parents if there's a dispute between the two parents where one parent believes the child should be put on puberty blockers, should be put on a path to cross-sex hormones, should be considering getting a mastectomy, and another parent who doesn't. It is considered child abuse in more and more family court jurisdictions not to, quote, affirm the gender of a child. They're calling the parent who stands in the way of having that child's endocrine system poisoned and stands in the way and says no to mutilating surgery, they're calling that protective parent the abuser. That's how far this has gone. Call CPS. Call child welfare. I'll bet you they're not going to do a fucking thing. One more.
Our family.
Oh, I put it on here.
The baby has been able to latch, but I've not been able to produce any milk. It's okay, because we're gonna supplement the feeding with formula so that my baby's still getting the nutrients that they need, but I'm still feeling hopeful. I appreciate you so much for all your work.
And I appreciate you also, baby. I couldn't have done it without you.
I appreciate you so much, baby. I couldn't have done it without you. That's also right out of a John Waters film. That's out of the deleted scenes from Pink Flamingos. I love you so fucking much, baby. It's a cavalcade of perversions. It's Madame Divine's cavalcade of perversions. So the two of them, these messes, these absolute utter psychiatric wrecks, are snuggled up in a bed with the baby on the guy's chest. And I don't know if it's that he's obese, and that's why his pecs look so big. I don't know if maybe he's had breast implants, but he gives the appearance of having breasts. The baby was able to latch on, but I wasn't able to produce any milk. I wonder why. We're still hopeful. For what? Do you think your man tits are just going to start making baby milk? These people are out of their fucking minds. And you're going to take a baby, a newborn baby, who needs to be fed breast milk. And for your narcissistic gratification, you are going to take your non-nutrition producing male breast and stick it in the baby's mouth. And this baby is latching on because that's an instinctive behavior. Babies suckle instinctively. They crawl up to the breast and they put their mouth on it. They know what they're doing. And you're giving that baby nothing. What are you, just teasing the child? This is what they are willing to do for their own personal gratification. This is disgusting. It's abuse. And this child, I don't care if neither of those parents ever raise a hand, a belt, or a wooden spoon to that child. That child is going to grow up incredibly abused. The emotional abuse, the derangement, the calling black white, the lack of reality in that household, that poor child has been born into hell. I can tell you that although my childhood was filled with physical violence, both from my stepfather and from my mother, I don't remember the sensation of the physical pain of being beaten, being cuffed, or even having my head pushed into a concrete wall. I don't remember the pain of that. I do remember the emotional torment, the psychological extortion, and the gaslighting. That was the legacy that screwed me up. The emotional dysregulation and the lack of reality in my household. Have a thought for this kid. I wish I could think that child welfare authorities would do anything about this, but I don't. Moving on. It's so grim. It is so, so grim. So last week, we went over the video from the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus, where they were allegedly joking when they presented a song called "We'll Convert Your Children." My friends, listeners, LGBTQ plus is after your children. They are after your children. It's not a joke. It's not a bigoted, right-wing, conservative, fundamentalist Christian point of view. They're after your children. This week in the UK, a library had a entertainment event for children to get them interested in reading. Let me give you a little bit from an article in the magazine The publication Spiked. Spiked-online. If you don't read Spiked, it's great. And this article is by Josephine Jo Bartosh. And she's been absolutely great on these gender issues. I get a lot out of her articles. You'll enjoy anything you see with her name on the byline. So in talking about the event was part of an Arts Council-funded initiative. One might be forgiven for thinking that this was a niche, risque performance for adults, but it was actually aimed at children aged between 4 and 11. What was it? Feast your eyes on this. A lovely rainbow. So what you're seeing here is a picture of one of the performers at this children's theme event to get them interested in reading, wearing a bodysuit and face paint. The bodysuit is in rainbow neon colors. And on the top are 2 prosthetic female breasts with nipples poking out. And between this guy's legs is a literal foot-long rubber penis. Yeah. And although you can't see it in the picture, I've seen video of this. When you turn around, there's a prosthetic naked ass sticking out the back of the bodysuit too. And this guy, along with a couple other performers, ran out in front of the library with some music playing and started dancing around like some wild rumpus out of a Maurice Sendak children's book, with this prosthetic cock flopping up and down. And this is a children's event that the library paid for, booked and paid for from a performing arts company. And naturally, when this went onto social media, people were outraged. But the initial response from the library staff, one of them responded jokingly, like it was cute, saying, "When you've got it, flaunt it." And in that tweet response the library staff member put up, included a picture of the guy in this costume. Just cute, huh? It's real cute. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for destroying 40 or 50 years of actual gay rights progress. Thank you for destroying all the progress we made in convincing the public that simply being a homosexual did not make you a pedophile. It's all gone now. Oh, I know. There's lots of gay people out there, and you may be one of them, who doesn't approve of this. I get it. I get it that normal people don't approve of this. But the problem is, all of us homosexuals, we are now assimilated under the LGBTQ plus banner. We did not speak up early enough. We did not push back when they started to erode our boundaries. We sat silently. We thought they'll get over it. They're just having a little bit of fun. I don't want to seem unaccepting. I want to be inclusive because I remember what it was like when I was not included. And slowly but surely, degree by degree, like the frog boiling in the pot, this is where we are now. And we are going to pay for this. Children are paying the worst price for this, but we are going to pay too. The backlash is building, and when it does, it is not going to discriminate either. It's going to hit us too. All right, it's time for a break. When we come back, we're going to have a conversation with my friend Jeannette Sherman, a fascinating woman who is going to tell us about how modern friendships are being structured along narcissistic validation rules. See you on the other side. Hey listeners, we now have a bonus for our supporters. You can help the Disaffected podcast grow and receive invitations for our off-air Zoom hangouts by becoming a supporting member on Patreon or Subscribestar. Patreon users, go to patreon.com/disaffected. Subscribestar users, you can find us at subscribestar.com/disaffected. Check out our webpage at disaffected.fm for the complete list of ways you can help support us. And thank you. Welcome back. We've got Jeannette Sherman, a friend of mine, on, who is going to talk today about how we are conducting friendships along what you might call narcissistic validation rules. Jeannette and I have had plenty of conversations with each other about cluster B, family dynamics, the sorts of things we talk about on the show. So, hi, Jeannette. Welcome.
Hi, it's really great to be here.
I appreciate it. So, before we get into it, why don't you just tell people how you know what you know and why you're a member of the Cluster B Kids Club along with me?
Yeah, absolutely. The club that I don't want there to be any more members of going forward, I want it to stay very exclusive. And unfortunately, it's getting bigger all the time. I grew up in a family with a mother who fits all DSM criteria, all 9 of them, for borderline personality disorder. My childhood was impacted every single day by cluster B, which I didn't know about until I became an adult. And I started to talk about my mother with some people, and they said, you need to read a little bit about this disorder, which sounds a lot like her. And it was like so many things fell into place. And talking to other people who had mothers with these characteristics, because they're so empty inside, what manifests as personality is so similar that the stories could almost be, exchanged from kid to kid. It was funny when I first started talking to you, it felt like your stories could have come from my mother and my stories could have come from your mother, who share a first name, in fact.
It happens all the time, doesn't it? I remember when, like you, and I think we children of cluster Bs, we end up reacting and developing our own ways of dealing with this, and in much the same way. I mean, in some sense, we end up in a way being as stereotyped as our parents are.
Yes.
In terms of what we go through, how long it takes us to wake up to it. And like you said just a minute ago, I didn't know any of this either when I was much younger. And once somebody said to me, like someone said to you, I think you need to read about borderline personality disorder, it didn't take but a couple of days until everything that I didn't think I understood all of a sudden slotted into place. So, I've had that experience where people they say, are you a long lost sibling? Because that's exactly the same phrase that came out of my mother's mouth.
Yeah, exactly. And I had an ex-husband who was a covert narcissist, which is, it's not the presentation of narcissism that people are used to seeing, but the way that manifested was a constant need for people to reassure him, no, we don't hate you. No, everybody likes you. And that can become this all-consuming drive and desire. And now that's just, to my mind, I see it becoming normalized as a part of just regular friendships.
Yeah, I see it being normalized too. And that's, that's a lot of what propelled this show propelled us to create this show. It's not just that we are dealing with a greater number of people with these personality disorders, and I believe we are. That is an important part of it. I have enough experience and I've looked at enough evidence to convince me that we do have a greater rate of cluster B disorders, narcissism, borderline, histrionic, and psychopathy. There are more of them than there used to be, but it still only takes a minority to make everybody around them play by cluster B rules. Our friendships, our work relationships, our political engagement. What are you seeing? What are you seeing in friendships and how we relate to each other today compared to something healthier?
Yeah, it seems to me that part of what friendship is, and part of what we used to think of friendship as, was looking at a friend and saying, I love this person. I want what's best for them. If they seem to be doing something that is not normal for them, if they seem to be doing something that is bad for them, that's harmful, then it's part of my job as a friend. And the better a friend I am, the more this is my responsibility. This isn't the fun part of being a friend, right? This is the part of being a friend. It's not the good part. You have to go in and say to the guy, this woman that you want to marry, I know this is a really tough thing to hear, but dude, I think she's an abuser. Or, you want to tell somebody, this this group of friends that you're getting into, it seems like since you've started talking to them, you're obsessed with something in a way that makes you more and more unhappy, and that's driving you more and more away from the things that used to center you and used to make you a good friend to have. And that kind of thing is just not even welcome anymore. You can look at any internet advice board. This is a great exercise to do, and see how many people just don't think you should ever interfere in a friend's decisions. Ever. No matter how bad the decision, they'll say, well, you know, the only thing that'll happen is you'll lose the friendship. And
yeah.
You know, it drives me crazy, because maybe if I tell a friend that somebody is somebody that they should not be with, that somebody is going to harm them in some way, maybe there's only a 10% chance they'll listen to me and a 90% chance that they'll tell me that I need to get out of their life. But you know, my best friend when I was a kid got murdered by her ex in front of their 5-year-old. And there are things that I can't stand by and let happen without saying something about it. I found out this past weekend, a friend of mine's husband has decided that he is engaging in a gender transition. He'd like to be known as the mother of the children whose actual mother spent pregnancy and breastfeeding off her bipolar medication, going crazy so that she could have the babies she always wanted.
Oh my God.
And I saw people who were ambivalent about this, people who have never liked this man, people who know that he has not treated her well, and his problems have been bad husband problems, not bad wife problems. And everybody just stood and said, congratulations. They called this man she. They used his brand new pronouns. By the way, the wife, all she wrote was life update. She didn't write, I love my trans wife. We're the new face of queer America. She wasn't even writing anything positive. Everybody just assumed, they jumped to this idea, well, she must be happy about it.
And how must she feel? Right? Like, I don't know, maybe you're going to tell me, but what I've known some women who've been in this position, and I've read a lot of accounts from women who've been in this position. And there's a huge disconnect between what people think. Well, you know what, this comes to, we are expected to perform a set of emotions in situations like this. This is scripted, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that most people, the default assumption is, okay, the emotions I'm supposed to perform right now are happy, happy, happy.
Yes.
And I don't even notice many people taking the time to stop and ask a woman, a friend who might be in this situation, privately, how do you feel about this?
Yeah.
Tell me what's going on. Tell me your story. I don't see people asking.
Right. And in this specific case, having heard this person talk about her marriage problems before, and knowing that essentially this was something from the bedroom, and to realize that, okay, this is something that started out in your bedroom, but now you want to bring your kids into it. Like, I'm sorry, to me.
Tell me a little more about that. How did it start in the bedroom? I mean, you don't have to be excessively graphic, but I'm trying to.
Ladies, a red flag for you. If what he really, really, really wants is pegging, and he's always angling in getting that, just run, just go the other way. That man is not really interested in like women, not like they want a part you don't have. Like, escape.
And viewers and listeners, if you don't know what pegging is, there's always Google.
So, you know, when
Yep.
people think that being submissive in the bedroom means that makes you a woman, and you've got a 6-year-old daughter at home that sees, you know, who used to be daddy now calling himself your mother and putting, you know, stuffing in his turtleneck. What does that tell her about what a woman is? What does that tell her about what she's developing into and what her role is? You know, it's just it offends me. I used to have this roommate. My roommate was a woman I knew very closely. We went to doula school together. We delivered babies together, and I helped to deliver her baby. Today, she calls herself a man. Her husband calls himself a woman. And their child, the one that I delivered in the living room, calls himself a they. And he's 12 years old. And he has anxiety problems. He's going to therapy. He can't be in regular classrooms. His parents have stymied his development by changing and taking the foundations out of the relationship as this child was getting older, as this child was developing. And as I look at my friend with the transitioning husband, and I look at her 6-year-old daughter with short hair, and I look at my friend herself who has short hair and who hasn't always fit a feminine ideal, and I see this happening again, and I can't let it happen. And so I did what I didn't do last time. I told her exactly how I felt.
How did she receive that?
For a long time, she didn't say anything. And actually, I thought that was kind of amazing because, I mean, I stopped just short of saying that her husband was a child abuser for doing this, honestly. And she didn't say anything. She didn't come to his defense. And then 36 hours later, I saw she'd unfriended me on social media, just the slow slip away. But I said what I needed to say, and that's important because here's the thing. I believe so strongly in these patterns about these narcissistic men that I know that in 2 years, she's going to be thinking, who was more right about how this was going to go? My friends who said this was going to be an amazing start to a new life where we'd be egalitarian and better partners than ever? Or was my friend who said this was a really bad road, is that friend going to seem more right? And the big thing I made sure to let her know is there is always room for you here, because I think she thinks even her own mother would disown her over leaving a trans husband.
Wow. See, this brings up, I don't know the situation, but there's a term that many women, not all, but many women use to describe themselves in the situation. They call themselves trans widows, right?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, and it's in a sense, the man that they married has died at least a social death.
If they
right?
want to, if the trans side wants to call it dead names, they have to accept trans widows. I mean, that's the deal. If something about that person has died enough that you can call it a dead name, then you can call it a dead marriage.
Really good point. Really good point. I have noticed in these conversations that, see, what we're talking about here, what you're talking about with men like this is called autogynephilia.
Yes.
Right? And a lot of people listening will know that, but for those of you who have not heard the term before, autogynephilia is a description of a certain kind of transsexual fetish. The idea, a man who gets erotic satisfaction out of conceiving of himself as a woman, having a woman's body, sometimes actually sexually attracted to that fantasy of himself. Or if not that, simply getting erotic gratification by believing that other people are experiencing him as a woman, or other people are treating him as a woman, particularly in a sexual situation, and treating him as a woman. Invariably, I've never seen a case where this isn't the case, means treating him like a submissive slut, right?
You very rarely see an autogynephile who really likes to do the dishes.
Even in just a maid's outfit and high-heeled shoes, that might be one way that making the dish could make the dishes sexy.
And look, feminists have noticed this autogynephilia thing, and they've noticed it because these are women imitators, right? But really, and this is something that I like about you, and this is something I like about your show, is that you've realized that the fundamental part of this actually has nothing to do with the gyna at all. Any autophilia, any time where what you think is the sexiest thing in the world is something about how people perceive you or something about how you are in the world, that is a narcissistic impulse. And because it's narcissistic, no matter what it imparts upon, it can't help but be some sort of weird, perverted caricature of what it sets out to portray.
It's absolutely narcissistic. I mean, it's astonishing to me sometimes that I feel that I need to point this out to people, but it does need to be pointed out. Somebody does have to say that very explicitly. Self-love, love of self, excessive self-love, narcissism. But what is frustrating about this, and when I say that I'm frustrated about this, I'm not actually trying to convey criticism to any of the women who share their stories. I myself, when I came out of an abusive relationship with my mother, although obviously, it wasn't an autogynephilia situation, I too wasn't fully aware of everything that was going on and was still making some excuses. But what I see, and I've seen this a lot in accounts from trans widows and people around them being supportive, saying, this whole trans thing turned him into a different person. Right? This took over his life. The husband I knew isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
I don't believe that. I don't believe it.
I agree.
I don't believe that this turned him into a different person. What I think is happening, because I believe that autogynephilia, and I'm saying this provisionally, I do believe this pretty strongly. If somebody can show me evidence to show me that I'm wrong, I will take that into account and I will change my mind. I haven't seen it yet. I don't believe there's such a thing as standalone autogynephilia. I don't believe that autogynephilia is a syndrome unto itself. I think it is a Baroque symptom of narcissistic/borderline personality disorder. Just as I think most trans identity is in fact a symptom and a culturally available expression of a symptom of borderline personality disorder. Just as many anorexics, right? The anorexia itself is not the primary condition. There's trauma underneath that, and often, but not always, trauma in the neighborhood of or completely in borderline personality disorder. So when I hear people say this turned him into somebody he wasn't, what I suspect is going on, that man was always a narcissist or a cluster B of some sort. It's just that the way he abused you, the way he took advantage of you emotionally, the responsibilities that he failed to take on board to share the partnership, those were more invisible to you because you saw them as typical, well, this is how men are, right? Men don't care about the housework. Men don't care about doing the emotional work. They may all have been either abusive or neglectful emotional traits, but they are invisible to a woman who is conditioned to see them as normal for men, but they're not normal. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that one of the big weird things about how we treat transition and this idea of transgender in our society is that in every other situation, if you start to get into a spiral where you're spending more and more of your time kind of draining your time and money and effort away on, like, if you were gambling, or, if you were going out to clubs just every night and just getting plastered and getting drunk, people would eventually say, like, you really should spend less time on that. And the interesting thing about transition is it gives men who are really interested in pornography a way to deepen an addiction and go into a spiral that people will feed instead of trying to get you out of it. And so all of the normal mechanisms that we have to arrest somebody going into that spiral, we can't get them out of it. We can't stop it and pull them back and get them to be more like they were before. Maybe they were narcissistic, but maybe they were to some extent trying to keep a cover on their pathology, right? But what transition does is it makes it so, you don't have to put a veil on. You can just say, look, I love just taking selfie after selfie after selfie, 1,000 selfies in a row. This is me becoming myself. Ah,
yes. Such a good point. The very things, because this is addiction, right? It's personality dysfunction and it's addiction. These things are heavily intertwined, right? It's self-harming behavior.
Right. And how many
self-harming behavior?
How many midlife crises can you have where all of your friends will tell you congratulations? You know, if you buy a sports car you can't afford, or you decide you're going to get a boat or something, or you have an affair with a woman 20 years younger, at least some people might, you know, risk their friendship with you to tell you that's a terrible idea. But fewer and fewer people are going to tell you to stop this.
Yeah, and not only, as you point out, not only are they not going to tell you to stop it, they are very likely to clap for you and say that was a good. You know what it reminds me of, Jeanette? It's like that. Yes, I should have pulled this clip. It's that Twilight Zone episode. It's the Twilight Zone episode where the little kid has powers.
The cornfield.
And he sends people into the cornfield, right?
We are all in the cornfield now.
Yeah, but all of the we are all acting like the adults in that episode, right? That was a very good idea, Johnny. That was a great thing to do. Wasn't it, Bill? Yeah. Really primo idea there, Johnny. I don't remember his name was Johnny.
There's just this kid with a they, them pronoun badge in the middle of it, right?
They did a very good thing, didn't they? Because we're all terrified of being sent to the cornfield.
Yeah.
Clearly, we are terrified of that. And I know you've seen it, but I see it all the time. I see people who are doing the clapping and saying that's a very good idea, you should do it more. I can tell just by the way they're speaking and their tone of voice that they don't believe what they're saying.
Yeah.
You know, there's an invisible and metaphorical gun being held to their head while they're saying it. And part of what I would like people like us who can see this and who talk about it to be able to do for people is to let them know it's sort of like signaling to a hostage, right? We know you're a hostage. We know this isn't normal. We know you don't mean it. You can come sit here.
Yes.
You know, there are places that are safe to tell the truth.
And the cornfield is at this point like abundantly full of new friends who will let you tell the truth.
Oh, yeah, and snacks and furniture, too. I mean, if we're going to all be in the cornfield, we're going to have to make this a nice little pad. So, you know, you can actually talk about things. It's very disturbing. And I don't know what it's going to take to get more of the public to talk about this honestly, too, because I feel like there's only so far we can go before the absurdity is going to crack. But what I worry about is I don't know how far we have to go before it cracks, and I don't know how much damage is going to happen until it cracks.
Well,
when you think about what do you think about it?
It's crazy making, right? Because imagine you're the woman I was talking about before, and your husband has decided that he's going to gender transition. Now imagine it's 3 years later. Some things have come to pass. You've decided this is no longer good for you. And you decide, you know, after long consideration, I'm leaving this man. 50 people are going to come forward to you and say, I always knew he wasn't a good one. They're going to say, I always kind of thought it was weird that he did that, but I didn't want to say anything. That is the sign of our times, right? Our society gets more cluster Bs because it rewards the cluster B. You get more of what you reward. And right now, the way to rise in social media, the way to, you know, make friends and influence people with the structures we have now, it kind of provides a golden road for people who are willing to go in with no real identity of their own, just willing to kind of go in, kind of like weaving through traffic until they get to the destination they want.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. And this is not, I mean, you know, this comes up on the show a lot because I end up speaking about trans issues a lot because I think they are the most pure example today of validated and socially praised cluster B identity and cluster B behavior. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I called it, I said this on Twitter earlier. The word trans is a magical spell. It's an incantation. It's a blinding spell. Mm-hmm. Right. It's a cloaking spell. It is so powerful that the very prefix itself is enough to shut people's minds off and make them instantly unable to see what's in front of them. But I think that dynamic of conceiving of friendship as a series of mutual validation sessions with no negative talk, no tapping on the shoulder to say, Jane, have you thought this through to the next step? Are you sure that this is something you want to get into? I think we're seeing this in all kinds of relationships and friendships these days that don't have anything to do with trans issues. And I, you know, and well, this is my show. I don't have to worry about what I'm going to say here, but I sort of do worry about it because I get in trouble, so to speak, with some people for saying this. I think that we are living in an era where our friendship rules and our social rules and our etiquette are a sort of caricatured feminine approach.
I was just going to say it. I was
okay, well then let me stop and let you
way,
take over. Run with that thought.
This is the way white girls used to fight in junior high, right? This is how frenemies happen. And this is the frenemies white girl phenomenon, right? And the reason you become frenemies is because you don't feel like you can have it out with each other. You feel like there's things that you want to say that you can't say. And over time that builds up, and the little thing that might have annoyed you and you could have cleared the air about, now you can't clear the air because it's been going on for years and that person's been building up on it. And this is how people become frenemies. And it's like we've taken this incredibly dysfunctional model, which we gave to girls because we weren't going to let them fight it out in the parking lot, right? And so we've taken this dysfunctional model and we've said, well, since violence is never the answer, this catty way that white girls were resolving their problem, who were the people in our society we least accepted a fight to come out of, that's how you all have to have conflicts now.
It's interesting because there's a lot of distance between a physical fist fight and complete compliance and submission, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, having a fist fight is not the only way to clear the air. It's not the only way to be honest. It's not the only way to express frustration, displeasure, or worry and concern. But we don't seem to have that middle ground anymore.
Yeah.
And it's splitting. Right?
That's exactly.
It's psychological splitting. It's all or nothing.
Exact word.
So, you know, I'm not sure how we get past that. And I'm still trying to wrap my mind around this because I've spent most of my life, you know, we've talked about this. You and I have had conversations about this. You participated in conversations I've had with other people about this. I spent most of my life, I would have said I was a man who was a feminist, right?
Yeah.
And I have always had more women friends than men friends. And, you know, it just was not possible for me to consider that there might be something culturally going on right now in a feminine way that was as much a problem or a problem in its own way as what people call toxic masculinity, right?
Yeah. And
it's
it's exactly
you know,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And you can see it in a lot of the online feminist communities, which become incredibly toxic and hostile very quickly. That lots of people have noticed this about them. But a lot of times right before they blow up, it's a validation station. It's a hug box. And then all of a sudden, these tensions that you didn't know were coming and that maybe came from cliques you didn't know existed. It is all junior high again, and it is the way girls interacted in junior high.
It's gratifying to have a woman say it and see. You're certainly not the only woman friend I have who sees this and who can say it. But you know, as you know, it's not the sort of thing that goes unremarked in a group of women. If you bring this up in conversation, that's going to provoke some hostility, isn't it?
I mean, look, at this point, you know, I've been a lot of things in my life. I change my mind when I see new evidence that is convincing. And the more that I see from a lot of the radical feminists, the more I realize that, you know, they're working from a utopian vision that works for a small minority of people and doesn't really take most people into account. There's not room for all of us in their vision. You know, there's not room as much for family structures. There's not room as much for women and who are mothers and who maybe want to be mothers. That whole idea that motherhood isn't like distracting you from feminism. Maybe your family could be an important part of your politics. I truly believe the personal and family structure stuff, that is political, that goes deeper, and that can be positive. But there's a lot of radical feminism that thinks it can only be negative. And so since they aren't finding the values they need in a family structure, an adult family structure, they look for the last social structure that they really understood and that they were really a part of. And that's high school and junior high in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. We get the models that we see. We don't have magic new models that we can create. So when people think that they're discarding something, they don't realize what they're picking up as a substitute.
Right. And I think this is also about, and I don't know how it happened. It seemed to just happen gradually until it became a reality. And then people looked around and said, oh gosh, I didn't mean for us to end up here. But I think that motherhood itself as an institution and as part of domestic economy somehow got devalued.
Yes.
I think it got devalued, and the idea was that the proper way for women to experience motherhood or to relate conceptually to motherhood was to see it as, well, that's what you do if you can't make it in the work world. That's what you do if you don't have a career. That's what you do if you don't have a life.
Yeah.
Right? And I remember, it would be interesting to see what you think about this when you think about your mother and her cluster B derangement. My mother held a lot of these attitudes, a lot of conflicting attitudes. I mean, my mother would be the first to tell you that she always wanted to have children, that being a mother was very important to her, that she wanted to love children and raise them. And, maybe at one time that was true, and maybe in some way that's true. And but she was also incredibly resentful at her perception that anybody should expect her to do that. She was resentful and angry that she couldn't be both a mother and a career woman. Right. And my mother has a lot of problems, and she's an incredibly abusive person. But the reality is that if you are a single mother, right?
Yeah.
You have a 40-hour-a-week job that you have to devote your all to. You're
Yep.
bringing home the bacon, and you're exhausted when you get home, and you've got 3 children and you've got nobody to lean on. I can well understand a feeling of conflict coming out of that. But as a result of this, I think a lot of women are really, really feel ambiguous about how much they should invest in motherhood, whether it's okay to see motherhood as their primary occupation.
Yeah.
That's what it looks like to me.
Well, and
what does it look like to you?
I've got it flipped in my house. We're a weird house, so I am the breadwinner in my house, and that's how I've liked it for a long time. And part of that does come from my childhood, when I had a mother who told me always that what would be a really good idea is to marry rich. And when I was fairly young, I dated for a little while and lived with a man who was an heir to a fairly large fortune. And when I was in that relationship, he called the shots. He was significantly older. And this was the relationship my mother had in some ways been setting up, for me to want to be part of since I was a child. And I found it stifling. I went back to school in order to get into a career where I could be both a mom and the person who was earning the money. And I've managed to work from home. I think this is actually going to become, people need to start thinking, because jobs are about to start getting more work from home-ish. And people keep thinking about that as meaning insular people in their apartment. But I have a different vision, because in my house right now, we have a stay-at-home parent and a work-at-home parent. Nobody misses a milestone. This is about to become reality, and it's not just for middle-class Americans with fancy office jobs. I'm telling you, I am telling you, based on the technology that is about to come out, factory jobs are about to be something that you can work from home within the next 20 years. And so this idea of the domestic economy, where families actually work together within the house where they see each other all the time, where you're not just seeing your kid for half an hour between daycare and bedtime. This is going to become the reality again, and we're going to have to learn how to live in families again.
That I can see a lot of good coming out of that.
Yeah.
And we forget this, you know, especially we Americans, we're very present focused, and we tend to think that whatever we remember from our childhood and maybe from our parents' generation is just the way normal things have always been. But it hasn't always been this way. I mean, look, you know, when we worked on farms, your home and the barn were all part of the same thing.
Exactly.
Right? Domestic economy wasn't just a term. It actually meant economy. Part of your job was getting up and gathering the eggs and milking the cows and putting up preserves for winter and doing all these things. Or, you know, you think about it in an English model, where when people started to move more into the cities, if you had a shop, you lived above the shop, right? That was part of the same building there. If you had a cobbler's shop downstairs, or, you know, if you were a greengrocer, the children were working in there, you were running up and downstairs to fix lunch and all this sort of stuff. You know, there are pros and cons to any sort of economic system, but this separation of the money making, the actual financial sustenance of the family from the experience of the home, that ultra suburban ideal that became so popular in the late 19th century. You know,
Yeah.
You get on a train and you are taken away from home into an office in an urban city. And that's not where living happens. That's where you make money. And then you get back on the train in the evening and you go back to this haven of nothing but domesticity.
And
it's
now
very
people-
recent and artificial.
Right. People think that's traditional now. People think that's conservative values. The real conservative value, the value that thousands of years of your ancestors, you know, formed family units and social relations to achieve, was a home that is inherently productive, where everybody is involved in producing what that home produces. And in an era where children are highly educated, like our era, a huge amount of that is in how much you are educating your kids and how much they are learning in the house.
Well, and you know, what are they being educated with?
Yes.
Right? Because when we look at public school these days, I mean, the kinds of thing, I talk about some of this on the show, there are a lot of people who talk about this, but the kind of shit they're teaching kids in school is, well, it's ridiculous. There's so much wokeness, but school children are not even coming out of school able to write a coherent one-page essay. The reading scores, I mean, the number of children reading proficiently at grade level, being able to do math proficiently at grade level, get worse and worse year after year. And it does not seem to index with how much money we put into the school system. We pour more and more money, we raise teacher salaries, and yet kids are not able to do subject-verb agreement in a sentence, for goodness sake.
And now
Right?
they're trying. They're trying to sell us the new bill of goods, right? They were going to try and say that online learning would fix this, and we have now had a year. I'm actually, if there's one thing I'm grateful to the pandemic for, and all of the overreaction, it's that we can look back on a year where 41% of Baltimore students got less than a 1.0 GPA. No joke. That's today's news.
Yep.
You know, we can look back on that year and say, you know what? Online learning is not ready for prime time. Like, the public schools do obviously have problems, but the idea, you know, that some people were starting to float, well, let's just replace the teachers with an app, not ready.
No, not ready at all. But yeah, online learning can't replace in-classroom instruction, but I'm glad I don't have kids, because I don't know what I would do. I think I would be very frustrated. I can't help but notice on the episode of the show last week, I don't know if you saw it or not, or if you listened to it, but I went over a business item from the meeting of the National Education Association, the largest teachers union in the country. And it was about critical race theory. which we all know is swarming into public and private schools, even as places like the NEA screech and scream and say, no, it isn't, while they actually adopt motions at their business meeting that says, we're going to fight people who are against CRT.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's almost schizophrenic.
It is.
But
It
I can't help but notice that the number of grammatical and mechanical errors in the writing within the minutes of the National Education Association worried me. And I'm not trying to be pedantic.
No.
I'm literally saying these are you know how I just said children can't do subject verb agreement? These adults can't do it either. Their sentences and the clauses in their sentences don't even make sense.
And it shows you how they think. How people write shows you how they think, sometimes in ways that you can't get from just talking to them.
Yeah. Or it shows you how they don't think or how they're not able to think. And I don't even mean that in an insulting or derogatory way. But if this is a reflection of how these people's minds are organized, it's very sad because they literally do not understand how to think rationally and how to connect concepts and how to move up a ramp step by step to get to a place where everything is tied together.
Here's what the NEA doesn't understand. NEA doesn't get that all of these DE&I, these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, these people call it critical race theory, and we've got to have some sort of shorthand to call it. What this really are, what we're really talking about, it's DE&I, and it comes from management classes. This comes from MBAs, okay? And the reason that, and they co-opt the academic language, so a lot of times it sounds kind of the same, but fundamentally, the reason you have diversity, equity, and inclusion in American companies, there may be some exceptions who are genuinely motivated about it, but it's anti-union. It's actually a union busting tactic. If you believe that you don't really have that much in common with your fellow guy that operates a press, then you're not going to try and form a press operators union. You think that you and this guy have totally different lives, totally different oppressions going on. You're not going to do it. And they have found this. You can go to the Harvard Business Review and see that DE&I keeps compensation down. It keeps people's expectations of compensation down, and it keeps them from fraternizing as much with people that are of other backgrounds. And this is working as intended. This isn't a flaw. This is a feature to the people who are putting it in.
That's fascinating, and it makes so much sense. It feels like one of those things that's obvious and right in front of me that I didn't even I didn't make the connection. But of course, this is about fragmenting people. That's what all this identity stuff is, right? It's not about authenticity. It's not about self-actualization in the real meaning of that word, not the frou-frou, bougie meaning of the word. It's about breaking connections between people, breaking the idea that you share something in common. You know, you don't share a common culture, you don't share common values.
Exactly.
You know, nothing.
And if you are divided, then the people who are over you can do whatever they want. And you'll just be squabbling for the scraps. You know, we live in a country where the wealthy already own more than 50% of the wealth. And when that's the case, it means that everybody else, everybody who's trying to sell you something, as long as you're not in that group, then you've got all the bottom feeders who are fighting for scraps. And that's what you are. You're just a scrap being fought over. And people need to start realizing that the people who are talking about these diversity and inclusion initiatives from the top have every motivation to keep you fighting at the bottom forever.
Yeah, they do. And, you know, it makes me wonder, we were talking earlier about this conspiracy of silence where everybody believes that what they have to do is perform happiness for someone's self-indulgent behaviors or for their destructive behaviors or behaviors that are really self-harm. And I'd have to guess that much the same thing is probably going on in workplaces in America when these DE&I initiatives are announced. I can't say this for sure, but I have a strong suspicion that a majority of people are internally rolling their eyes, find this to be a waste of time, find it to be misdirected, but that they all feel compelled to clap for it and say, that's a very good idea. We should do more of that.
I recently interviewed for, and this was, I recently interviewed for a company where they were selling software that they say will make you more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive. They didn't even really believe in it. But here's the software that they're selling that basically an HR person, let's face it, an HR woman, is going to be sitting in front of all day that says, don't say self-starter in your job ad because women and Black people won't apply as much. And it's like, you're going to sit there all day and hear stereotypes just at you. How is that not a hostile work environment, right? Like this, you're thinking about the people who are sitting there reading this and having themselves corrected and having their speech edited all day to keep within these dictates.
It's so weird. I have to believe that most people don't actually believe this stuff, because as a gay man, I remember when I was a teenager and a young adult, I experienced more instances of I'm not going to use the word homophobia because that's a fallback word. I experienced, it was more common in those days for people to make an off-color joke at the expense of gay people, whether they meant it in an actually hostile way or if they were just being socially clumsy, didn't matter. It was more common to see people fired or have their reputation smeared if somebody found out that they were a homosexual. So I have some experience of being a young adult in the world when that kind of legal and extra legal discrimination, if you will, was actually more common. But it has not been that way for years. I don't remember the last time I ever felt in a professional situation, either at my job, when I was invited to speak at a conference or anything like that, where I ever had an inkling that somebody had a problem with me because they perceived that I was gay. And I'd really like to know if you could get women, Black people, Asian people, if you could get them all in a room or all in a place where they felt safe to tell the truth. I would like to know, is that been their experience too? Are they like me? Do they say, I don't actually run into racist people every day? I would guess that. But because we can't have that conversation, I don't know what the average Black woman or Asian man would say if he didn't think somebody was looking over his shoulder.
And it depends, right? So I was at a conference just before all the pandemic stuff started, and there was a woman with incredible experience and reputation in her career field. And when they called her up to the stage to do her presentation, they made a joke that she was a dominatrix. And you could see this 50-year-old woman as her face kind of went completely red, and she, felt very devalued with her 25 years of experience in software development, And so you do see those things, and they do, but, here's the thing, that stood out. There's a time when if you were going to the conference, a slap on the ass wouldn't have been that surprising. The fact that is kind of shocking, it's okay to have occasional shocking things happen. We can all talk about it. We can all say, that was shocking, you shouldn't do it again. And we get a little bit better. I'm kind of a believer in that sort of incrementalism about our society. And I think it's been working pretty well so far.
I'm really glad you said that, because that's it right there. The very fact that we experience that as shocking demonstrates the progress we've made.
Yeah.
But if there's a news story written about an incident like that, that's not the gloss they're going to put on. They're going to say, look, it's still happening. Look, it's just as bad as it always was. No, because when it was that bad all the time, it never would have made the news because nobody would have considered it shocking.
And it actually becomes more and more newsworthy, right? If you've got 7 billion people on the planet and just one guy says a sexist thing one day, but every paper decides to print it, this is still a big problem in the world, they'll say, because they've got a lot of ink spilled.
Yep. Fascinating. Well, we've gone from Cluster B Kids Club to autogynephilia and trans widows, children and economics, and now we're talking about incremental progress and discrimination. We have covered the gamut.
Yes.
Jeannette, thank you very much for joining me to talk on the show. We will do this again. You are one of the people that I really appreciate being able to have a conversation with, as my political opinions and my experiences have changed over the past few years. And I know that for you, some of that has been true for you as well. And thank you for not only having the conversation with me, but for having it for our listeners as well.
Thank you for having me on the show. I really like it, and I love what you're doing here.
Make sure to subscribe to Disaffected on your favorite streaming audio platform so you can take us along for the ride. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and almost anywhere else you get your podcasts. Welcome back. You know, when people talk about millennials growing up and entering the workforce, and now Generation Z or whatever it is that we're calling people in the younger generation, a lot of people have said, we don't have to worry about the work world changing mores, changing cultural standards, because when these snowflakes get into the real world and the real workforce and nobody will put up with their nonsense, they'll get a lesson in reality and everything will go back to normal. Everything will stay normal. No, it won't. No, it won't. We're already there. And it's not normal. It's only getting more abnormal. The millennials are in the workforce and have been for a while, and they are moving into management and they are moving into positions of seniority and influence. And we are reaping the rewards and paying the price. There is no effective pushback because older people are terrified of them. It's almost as if the way that media companies prize the demographic between 18 and 24, or between 24 and 35. Basically, everybody who wants advertisers wants to get people under 45 years old. And it's almost as if we've adopted that culturally too, that the only people who matter are young people. And if they say something, we have to do it. And if we don't like what they're doing, we can't say anything to them. I do not know why we are so afraid of them, but we are. I saw a citation to an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics, published June 8th, 2021. Frustratingly, I could not find the entire paper, so I can't read the entire paper to see if there's something that would justify what's so alarming in this abstract, but I'll tell you that I suspect I would not find anything in this paper that would justify this. So let me read the abstract to you. The title of this is LGBT Testimony and the Limits of Trust. Quote, in Forever Young, The Ethics of Ongoing Puberty Suppression for Non-Binary Adults, Notini et al. Discussed the risks, harms, and benefits of treating non-binary patients via identity-affirming ongoing puberty suppression. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Notini et al.'s article makes a strong case for OPS's permissibility, and their conclusion will not be disputed here. God, this writing is shit. Instead, I directly focus on issues that their article addressed only indirectly. This article will use a hypothetical case study to show that while Notini et al.'s ethical conclusion might be spot on, that perhaps the method they took to get there was superfluous. If the medical community is to take LGBT testimony seriously, as they should, then it is no longer the job of physicians to do their own weighing of the costs and benefits of transition-related care. Assuming the patient is informed and competent, then only the patient can make this assessment, because only the patient has access to the true weight of transition-related benefits. Moreover, taking LGBT patient testimony seriously also means that parents should lose veto power over most transition-related pediatric care. Parents should lose veto power over most transition-related pediatric care. So not only should doctors not be able to influence these decisions because patients are assumed to be informed and competent, But parents should not be able to stop a doctor from providing hormones or doing a mastectomy on a minor or doing an I'm not going to try to pronounce it, slicing the balls off. Like what happened to Jazz Jennings. This is alarming. Again, I haven't been able to read the paper, but I cannot imagine something that would make me find this less sinister than I actually do. This is called the informed consent model. It's a very cluster B name, isn't it? Because it's the opposite of the truth. Informed consent presumes that a person can consent to a service or to a treatment because they are fully informed of the risks and benefits. Fully informed. Do you know what informed consent for cross-sex hormones looks like at Planned Parenthood clinics in the United States? It looks like giving young girls who come in and say they're men or they're boys and they need to be on testosterone, giving them an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper with a whole list of this might happen, blah, 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 having them read it and sign it, and 15 minutes later they're walking out after getting their first testosterone injection and they've got a prescription. I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of these cases reported. This is happening in Planned Parenthood. That's informed consent. That's bad enough, but now these authors want to argue that parents should lose veto power over surgeries and cross-sex hormones for children in the Journal of Medical Ethics. Reversal. Do you see it yet, folks? Moving along. Histrionics. I don't talk about histrionic personality disorder as much as I talk about borderline and narcissistic personality disorders and psychopathy. It's, in my view, to the extent that people who have histrionic personality disorder discretely, and I've said before, I'm no longer convinced that there are 4 discrete cluster B personality disorders. I think it's probably more accurate to say the kind of disorder, the kind of personality organization is cluster B and it has features of, and then you might list some from borderline, you might list some from histrionic. But to the extent that somebody is a pure case of histrionic personality disorder, in my view, they're probably the least dangerous of all of them. They can be very wearing, they can be very tiresome, they can be irritating. But in the experience I've had, they are not as frequently malicious and dangerously manipulative as some of the other cluster B disorders are. But nonetheless, the histrionic tendencies in woke left culture are ever more pronounced. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about somebody that we could say is actually an example of a person with full-blown histrionic personality disorder, or if we're talking about how the culture has features of, because the culture certainly has features of. So this announcement came out this week from the American Booksellers Association, which, as its name suggests, is a trade association for bookstores. They were coy, and they did not name the book, of course, because to name the book would be to compound the harm. But the book that they are likely referring to is almost certainly Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, her blockbuster book on what is being done to young girls with gender-affirming care. And if it's not that, it might be the UK writer Helen Joyce's brand new book, which just came out the other day, called Trans, which is an examination of this in a broader way. So I would bet good money this is either Abigail Schreier's book or Helen Joyce's book. So we'll put this up on the screen. This is the announcement that the American Booksellers Association put out to the world. An anti-trans book was included in our July mailing to members. This is a serious, violent incident that goes against ABA's ENDS policies, values, and everything we believe and support. It is inexcusable. We apologize to our trans members and to the trans community for this terrible incident and the pain we caused them. We also apologize to the LGBTQIA plus community at large and to our book selling community. Apologies are not enough. We've begun addressing this today and are committed to engaging in the critical dialogue needed to inform concrete steps to address the harm we cause. Those steps will be shared in the next 3 weeks. Oh, it's going to say it's masturbatory. It's masturbatory. It's histrionic and it's masturbatory. So they included a notice about a new book available to their members who are bookstores, and they call it an anti-trans book because anything that does not lick the stiletto heels of trans women is called anti-trans. And they said that the inclusion of this book was a serious, violent incident. Violent. God, these people drive me crazy. And I thought to myself as I was reading this reminds me of something. What is it? I figured it out just before we started recording the show this week. This is what it reminds me of. Oh my God, I am heartily sorry for having offended thee, and I detest all my sins because I dread the loss of heaven and the pain of hell, but most of all because they offend thee, my God, who are all good and deserving of all my love. I firmly resolve with the help of thy grace to confess my sins, to do penance, and to amend my life. Amen. This is an act of contrition. This is a religious act. It's a religious demonstration. It's self-flagellation. It's self-mortification. It's public confession. It's narcissistic because it's performative. They are performing the confession of their sins for you. This is not between them and their priest. It's between them and the world, the media. It's creepy. It's a woke act of contrition. And I wanted to show you an example of the reaction to it. Of course, thankfully, a lot of people were as put off by this as I was. But there were, of course, many, many people. They concentrate themselves on social media. You'll find a high proportion of people who think that this is a virtuous act on social media. And I noticed a series of responses from a user named Anne Ogborn that I thought were remarkable because they were as histrionic as the original itself. So let's look at the first one here, the first reaction. Anne Ogborn says, physically recover every single copy shipped. Tell your customers you won't ship to them until the books are recovered. Replace every single person on your selection committee with a trans person. Commit to sending a pro-trans book with every order for the next 5 years. Bitch, you're pretty entitled. And wasn't done. Next one. Drop the book's publisher and any other publisher who publishes hate. Publish a complete account of how this happened, including names of all employees involved. Fire all involved in the decision and their managers transitively up to the CEO. This is deranged. This is utterly deranged. And don't think for a minute that there isn't a satisfaction being had here by Anne that's very close to the erotic. She is getting off on this. Well, what kind of woman is she? Let's look at her profile. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Anne Ogborn, logic programmer, SWI prologue, I don't know what that means, social roboticist, something else I don't understand, crotchety trans woman, transitioned in 1984. Well, that was predictable, wasn't it? This is somebody we're supposed to believe it's just a woman, not at all obsessed, having no problems going on upstairs. This is just normal. This is just what women think about things. Right. Am I going to say? Yes, I am going to say this. I'm trying to find a way to say this that is not, I'm not trying to be insulting. I am insulting sometimes, and I'll cop to it when I am, but I'm not actually trying to degrade anybody or insult anyone when I say this. I mean what I say plainly. I have noticed among people like this, in this part of the trans community, there's a phenomenon going on that I think is something like Revenge of the Ugly Ducklings. And by ugly, I do mean physically ugly. We're not supposed to talk about this because it's mean, but I think there is something to it. I think that people who are not conventionally attractive or who don't perceive themselves as attractive conventionally or desperately insecure, and not just insecure, but insecure at a psychiatric level, the kind of insecure that will drive you to change your body so that you can be a facsimile of the other sex. I think part of what we're living through is a revenge of the ugly ducklings. People who... There's a line from one of my favorite television series that encapsulates this, that displays this. Feud Betty and Joan. We're going to talk about gay shit here for a second. This was an FX series starring Jessica Lange as Joan Crawford and Susan Sarandon as Betty Davis. It aired 2 or 3 years ago. It's a mini-series that documented those two movie stars when they worked together on the only picture they made, which was Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. They had a famous rivalry. They hated each other. They were deliciously catty to each other. But this is, if you have not seen this show, it is some of the best television I've seen in decades. It's better than a high-quality drama movie. They do these women justice. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you want to look at a study of narcissism and personality instability, you could do a lot worse than looking at that. There's a scene where they have a fight, and Joan Crawford gets extraordinarily upset. She feels that Betty Davis has betrayed her. And she says to her, because Betty Davis was insecure about the way she looked, Joan Crawford was a world-renowned beauty. And even if you're thinking of the painted-on eyebrows and all that stuff, that came later. That hardened look came later. Look at her as a young woman, just breathtaking. She had the face of a goddess. Betty Davis didn't. You know, she wasn't beautiful on that level. And Joan liked to needle her. And she said to Betty Davis, the solution to feeling unattractive is not to make yourself even uglier. And it's a harsh thing to say, but it was said in the context of criticizing Betty Davis's makeup choice on this picture, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. And there's some truth to it. Some of these people seem to me to be glorying in the fact that they know they're not conventionally attractive, and they might even be ugly or unappealing. But we have to pretend they're stunning and brave, because if we don't, we are socially punished. And you see this. I wonder if I've probably said enough about that. And I really don't mean it to be cruel, but there isn't any way to say it except saying it. And I see this a lot. Another topic here, the COVID pandemic. So I decided just to go through CNN's website and see what kind of nonsense they were up to with COVID. And they have an interview with Dr. Leanna Wen. She's a Washington Post columnist and works for CNN as what they call a medical analyst. So they wanted to get her take on the CDC guidance for opening schools this fall. So I'm going to read to you some of the back and forth between the CNN reporter and Leanna Wen. So CNN says, with the more contagious Delta variant circulating, are these CDC guidelines enough to keep students, teachers, and staff and their families safe? Response from Dr. Wen. Yes, at this point, we have plenty of data that schools can be very safe from a COVID transmission standpoint if mitigation measures are followed. The CDC has been very thoughtful in its guidance, which cites numerous scientific articles to explain its strategic approach. CNN. But what about not being able to have 6-foot physical distancing? The CDC is saying that this is no longer required. Do you see how they don't like that? What about not being able to have that? Response from Dr. Wen. For many schools, it wouldn't be possible to have all children back full time and still keep 6-foot distancing. Duh. That's why the CDC says to try to keep 3-foot distancing and to employ other mitigation measures to make up the difference as needed. And then she goes on and gives this disquisition about layers of protection and do this and do that and the other thing. Nowhere in there does anybody justify 6 feet or 3 feet because it's nonsense and it makes no sense and it doesn't do anything, which they know. CNN asks, when can kids stop wearing masks in school? Dr. Wen. Again, I'd think of this using the weather and layers analogy. If the vaccination rate in a community is very high and the level of coronavirus is very low, it is conceivable that indoor masking no longer needs to be enforced. However, we are not yet there as a country, and that's why the CDC is saying that masks are required indoors for unvaccinated people. And here's the best part. Children and their infection risk from COVID. CNN's question. What does the latest data tell us about infection rates for children and the severity of their symptoms? This is important. I'm going to read this to you and then I'm going to go back and point this out. Dr. Wen responds. During the pandemic, more than 4 million children have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Listeners, hold that thought. More than 4 million children have been diagnosed with COVID-19. We're going to come back to that. Dr. Wen says, as more adults are now vaccinated, children make up a larger proportion of those getting infected. As of July 8, children make up more than 1 in 5 new infections. The Delta variant is the most contagious variant we have seen, which may mean that unvaccinated children are more likely to transmit and to get infected with this variant than before. Hear that language, which may mean that unvaccinated children are more likely to transmit. She doesn't know this. Nobody knows this. It's not clear that children become more ill. And we need to keep in mind that in general, children with COVID-19 infections tend to get much less severely ill than adults. However, children can have long-term consequences from COVID-19 that last months or potentially even years. Can they? Based on what? Based on what data? We haven't had this virus long enough to know this, and the rate of children's infections is very small. This is what I want to point out. I want to bring you back to something she said earlier. During the pandemic, more than 4 million children have been diagnosed with COVID-19. I don't think that's true. It sounds very alarming, doesn't it? But I don't think it's true. I went to the American Academy of Pediatrics and looked up the data that Dr. Wen, I think, was relying on. This is what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. As of July 8th, over 4.06 million children have tested positive for COVID-19 since the onset of the pandemic. That's not the same as being diagnosed with the active infection COVID-19. Dr. Wen said more than 4 million children have been diagnosed with COVID-19. No, they haven't. If the American Academy of Pediatrics' data is accurate, 4 million children have tested positive. But can we even rely on that? No. Why? Because tested positive appears to mean that they had a positive result on a PCR test, polymerase chain reaction, and that is a process that amplifies tiny fragments of DNA from a tissue or a biological sample so that it produces enough copies of this DNA to be able to detect if a certain pathogen is there. The problem with the PCR test, and many people have been pointing this out, is the more cycles you run, the more amplification you get, the higher the rate of false positives. So there's a very high false positive rate there, besides which a PCR test, if I'm understanding this correctly, and I think I am, but it's possible that I'm not. And if one of you knows the answer to this and find that I'm incorrect about this, leave a comment or send us an email because I want to be accurate about this. But the problem here is that these positive tests show only that they detected a fragment of the genome, the DNA sequence of the coronavirus. That does not mean that you actually have the illness COVID-19. Do you see the slippage here? Unless I'm misunderstanding this, and I don't think I am, I think it's just another example of how far the media will go to distort and walk right up to the edge of lying in order to make you feel fearful. Do you really believe that 4 million United States children had an active COVID-19 infection? And even if they did, they didn't. But even if they did, the likelihood that it caused them anything that they noticed at all, any symptoms they actually noticed, or that those symptoms were more severe than a cold, is very, very small. How small? Again, from the American Academy of Pediatrics. At this time, it still appears that severe illness due to COVID-19 is rare among children. Children were 1.3% to 3.6% of total reported hospitalizations, and between 0.1% and 1.9% of all child COVID-19 cases resulted in hospitalization. So that means of all the children who had COVID, and I don't know what they're referring to. I don't know if they mean they just tested positive with a PCR test or if they had an active diagnosable infection. Of all those children, depending on which study they looked at, between 0.1%, so that's 0.1%, to almost 2% of all childhood COVID-19 cases, only that many resulted in hospitalization. How many died? Same source. Of the states they looked at, 0% to 0.03% of all child COVID-19 cases resulted in death. At most, 0.03%. That is so vanishingly small that it is what we call statistically insignificant. No. It's not insignificant that any child died. You know that, right? I don't have to say this. But the chances are essentially zero that your child is going to die of COVID. And yet we have CNN talking about this. About why children have to be 6 feet apart, or at least 3 feet apart, and why they have to wear masks. Good God Almighty. I won't read you any more from that interview with Dr. Wen, but she goes on and on more about layers. I mean, it sounds like she's talking about wearing clothes. You got to have a mask, and then maybe you'll have a double mask, and blah, 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 blah. My favorite governor, Andrew Cuomo, who can't stop yapping about COVID and vaccines. I want to show you a tweet from this guy, and I want you to keep in mind when I show you this, what I said about the apology, the mea culpa, the mea maxima culpa from the American Book Association, about how it's really an act of contrition. So let's look at Andrew Cuomo's tweet. He says, reminder, masks are still required on the MTA and public transit. So buses, subways, etc. Wearing a mask on the train or bus is a sign of respect for your fellow riders. It can help prevent the spread of COVID and the flu and common cold, too. Notice this. The first thing he said after reminding people that masks are still required by law on public transportation in New York, the first thing he said to justify it was that it's a sign of respect. That was most important to him. Before the actual health claim, which is it can help prevent the spread of COVID and the flu and common cold too. This is a tell. This is people telling on themselves to you. Notice these things. This is about signaling your fealty to the COVID religion. This is why he wants you to do this. This is why they all want you to do it. Yes, I know there are doctors out there who genuinely care about keeping people healthy. But this discourse that we get from the CDC, that we get from the major media, that we get from any of these spokes doctors who love to see and hear themselves, this is about controlling you and making sure that you wear the religious garment, the yarmulke, the headscarf, the face burqa. They care first and foremost about the signs and symbols of your loyalty and obedience. And that's what this is all about. Our culture commands us to create false idols and to worship them. Don't comply. Don't genuflect. Don't make the gesture. The woke God is a false God. It's a golden calf. It's a graven image. For some of you, this is literally true. For others of you who are non-believers like me, it's a metaphor. But it's no less true for being a metaphor. The woke God is a false God. And worshiping the woke God is a living death. So get off your knees. Don't bow down. You and I, all of us, we deserve something better. We deserve something truer, something more honest out of life. So let's have it. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week.